A lecture in the Ralph Miliband lecture series, which goes on for the whole of this academic year, on the future of capitalism. The theme this evening, or the title this evening, is Them and Us, How Capitalism Without Fairness is Capitalism Without a Future. And when I thought of this, Will, and I was thinking about your lecture title, I thought to myself, well, it does beg the question that capitalism has had one hell of a future already, as it were, without much of a sense of fairness, in a sense, the past. And so I'll be interested to know how you address this the particular issue of the relationship between capitalism and fairness and the sustainability of capitalism running now and onwards, as it were. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce Will Hutton, and I'll do so sort of personally and formally, as it were. I've known Will for a very long time. We've traveled through life's highways and byways together for many years. I have come to know him both as a great journalist, as a writer of very successful books, but also not just as a fantastic colleague, but as a fine, fine friend. So it's very significant for me that you're here this evening, Will, and I welcome you and hope very much that the questions are acute, and so acute that we force the development of your current project, which is a book precisely on these themes. Let me introduce now Will a little bit more formally and just run through his very brief CV. He is currently Executive Vice Chair of the Work Foundation, having served as its Chief Executive already since 2000. He began his career as a stockbroker and investment analyst before working in BBC TV and radio as a producer and journalist. Prior to starting with the Work Foundation in 2000, he spent 4 years as Editor-in-Chief of The Observer, and of course he writes a very distinguished economic commentary column for the paper on a more or less weekly basis. He has written many, many best-selling books. You know most of the title because they're very similar. The World We're In, The State We're In, The State to Come, common theme there, The Stakeholding Society, and On the Edge, edited with Anthony Giddens. In addition, he won the Political Journalist Year of the Award in the middle of the 1990s. The other roles he performs, that's other than the Work Foundation, are many and numerous, just a couple here. Membership of the Government Advisory Panel on New Industry, New Jobs, Universities and Skills, Fellow and Governor of the London School of Economics and Political Science, Honorary Fellow, Mansfield College, Oxford, Visiting Professor, Manchester University Business School, and several more. His latest book, The Writing on the Wall, China and the West in the 21st Century, was published to much acclaim in the UK and elsewhere in 2007. He's now writing a book on these very themes of capitalism and fairness, to which the theme of which, of course, is his subject for tonight. So please join me in giving him a particularly warm welcome.
Well, thank you very much for that, David. I hope you can all hear me. Is the mics working? Are they working?
Yes.
Yeah. I've been working today on an exchange. I've exchanged with George Osborne that you will all read in Sunday's Observer. See what George Osborne's got to say about the financial crisis. Anyway, what I'm going to do tonight is just spend, and it's a bit of a dry run. So this is a kind of dress rehearsal. I want you to be very sympathetic to me in my dress rehearsal. I'm feeling quite nervous about it. It's the first time that I've tried to kind of integrate all my ideas in one 40 or 45 minute lecture. It is really a helicopter view of the book I've been working on for the last 8 or 9 months, which is called Them and Us. Them, the financial oligarchs, us, the people who obey the rules, really. And it takes as jumping off point the financial crisis. I'm going to say a few words about that and the condition of Britain at the moment. I then want to spend just a minute or two trying to think clearly about what we mean by fairness. And I am going to try and answer David's challenge about capitalism. It wasn't very fair from the Enlightenment onwards, but it was a great deal fairer than it had been beforehand. And I think that was the secret, really, of the growth story of the last couple of hundred years. I want to say something about where we are politically. And I also want to deal with what I call, and this follows the writing on the wall, David. I mean, the Chinese always talk about the three represents. Well, tonight I'm going to have the five rebalancings. And I'm going to chat, because I think that the next decade or two have five huge challenges, four of them domestic, one of them international, and I don't think they can be answered successfully without a clear grasp and a clear understanding of what we mean by fairness, around which we can build a consensus at home and abroad. But I want to start with the financial crisis. Andrew Haldane is the executive director of the Bank of England, produced earlier this week a paper in which he said that the IMF was wrong. The IMF calculates that the support given by Western governments to the banking system was $9 trillion. He says that's completely wrong. It was $14 trillion. That's 25% of world GDP. And of course, we've had the biggest recession since 1929-31. Outside war, this is the biggest event of any of our lifetimes. And the British banking system very nearly went bust just 12 months ago. Royal Bank of Scotland was hours away from closing. The Treasury had contingency plans for a 3-day bank holiday in which you would not have got cash out of your ATM. We live in a cash-free society with a cropped banking system. And there were similar near-death events in America and in other leading capitalist countries. In the mid-1980s, bank assets were twice GDP. Last year, they were 5 times GDP. Bank assets went from twice British GDP to 5 times British GDP. At the same time, the capital that underpinned it went from 5 to 1. So the capital that supported this more than doubling of bank assets fell by 500%. There was no deposit insurance. There was no lender of last resort facility. It was one of the most extraordinary stories of our time. And some of you may be Sunday Times readers. You'll have read Lloyd Blankfein, the chief executive of Goldman Sachs, arguing that the bankers do God's work. And he thinks that in November 2009, he certainly thought that in the run-up to the crisis in 2007. And the argument, the moral argument behind this extraordinary growth of finance was these bonuses, the scale of what we're doing, is not just economically efficient, it's the fair reward for our innovation. It's fair. And actually, we live in a society in which the rich have started to say that it's only fair that they're rich, and it's only fair that they don't pay much tax. Remember Michael Caine's reaction to the 50p tax rate? He thought it was outrageous that a hardworking Michael Caine was going to pay 50p tax for some scrounger who didn't go to bed in the morning. It's only fair for me to pay 40% tax or no tax at all. And we have an amazing inversion, really, of this conception, in which actually the business elite, media oligarchs, Berlusconi regarding himself as the most victimized man in creation. It's hugely unfair that I, having avoided all those taxes, should have to appear before Italian magistrates 3,000 times. The victimization of the rich, when held to account by us, because they say it's unfair that we should unchallenge what they regard as their due desert for their innovation and their effort. And in a way, it's been a kind of brilliant rhetorical device to justify a grotesque bargain between us and finance. $14 trillion worth of support, 25% of GDP, says Andrew Haldane, is the total support across the West. In the UK, it's $1.7 trillion. Base money which is the amount of money, is a measure of liquidity the Bank of England has had to put into the banking system, has gone up by 4 times. That's in just 2 years, more than any time in its history since its foundation in 1694. The amount of the balance sheet of the Bank of England is more distorted than even in wartime, even at the height of the First and Second World War. The Bank of England did not have to support the banking system as much as it does now. It's astonishing, and we're underwriting it, and the bonuses are carrying on, and we're told unless we pay them, then people will flee to another bank or they'll go offshore. We have a situation in which gross inequality and grotesque bargain between one part of the business community and the rest of us, and actually colossal inefficiency is described as actually fair. And we don't even, and I think the Archbishop of Canterbury is right. We haven't had, I think that Stephen Green of HSBC, 1 or 2 others have said sorry, but we haven't actually had any mea culpa really from the bankers. What they have told us is that it must be business as usual if we want our money back. And I think this is a growing sense. If the elite think like this, you shouldn't be surprised if ordinary men and women do. We live in what I increasingly call a have what we hold society. We are all thinking that the others are getting away with it, and that in some sense we are not getting a fair bargain. Too many scroungers, too many immigrants. There's an undeserving rich. There are tax evaders. The MPs fiddling their expenses. Sportsmen diving in the box. Every bloody football manager in the Premiership still stands up after every game and says it's not fair because of some refereeing decision. Again, the victimised Mr. Alec Ferguson or the victimised Arsene Wenger after a ruling has gone the wrong way. It's not fair, they cry. There is no, when we're using, this word is thrown around, it has come to justify victimization, it's come to justify a grotesque bargain, it's come to justify a really kind of unfair social arrangement. And I think the most corrosive thing of all about it is that it's left all of us thinking that only the naive and idiots play by the rules. I think that the defensiveness of our society, its cynicism, much of the suspicion that actually defines British social and economic life kind of has its origins in that we've lost our, we've actually just lost a moral compass about something as basic as what constitutes fairness. And I think that we've lost our religious root kind of anchorings and our moorings. If we're going to live by secular rules, and we are living by secular rules, we better be clear about some basic things about actually what fairness means. Otherwise, I don't think you can build a coalition actually to reform the banking system. I don't think you can build a coalition to solve social polarization. I don't believe you can build a coalition to reform the parliamentary system. I don't believe that you can build a coalition, actually do the things that are required internationally, and everything from climate change through kind of reorganizing the international financial system. Unless we have everyone can sign up to and have a clear understanding of what's fair, I think we're in trouble. Here I want to take you on is this mic not working? I look like Ghoul, did I? Some spectre. I beg pardon? Yeah, I can go back to the start if you want me to. But, and here I want to make a kind of big statement. I mean, the first of a number of big statements I want to make tonight. Every baby of every kind of ethnicity in every continent is born with an intuitive capacity to be able to speak and have to want to hold people to account for their intentions. We have an intuitive capability as human beings to hold people to account for their intended actions. if you intend harm, I don't like it, and my peers will actually punish you. If you intend a good thing, we like it. Mark Hauser, in his book Moral Minds, he's professor of cognitive evolution in Harvard, has conducted 220,000 experiments with people from 70 countries, all genders, all ages, and he comes up with a series of tests. There isn't time in 40 minutes to go through it. In the book I do. He, I think, makes it is absolutely, I think, incontestable once you've looked at his tests and once you've read his stuff. You simply have to accept that actually it is part of your human condition, like standing up, making love, being thirsty. You actually want to hold people account for their intentions. You just do, all of you. What's more, you do it in proportion. I mean, the reason why, going back to Greece, that actually justice was always about scales, is about the proportionality of the reward or proportionality of the punishment. It was Plato who wrote, and I think it's a lovely quote, if we disregard due proportion, by giving anything what is too much for it, too much canvas to a boat, too much nutriment to a body, too much authority to a soul, the consequence is always shipwreck. So we begin to know something about what fairness constitutes. We know that there's a sense of proportionality. We know that it's about holding you account, being accountability process for one's intentions. But it's not just about punishment and honor and happiness. It's about the distribution of goods and resources in society. Now, pre the Enlightenment, this is a crucial point for David. Pre the Enlightenment, fairness was pretty much kind of ascribed by birth. You knew if you were a Greek nobleman, it was fair that you had privileges because you were a Greek nobleman. Equally, because you and you deserved to be poor. It was ascribed. What happened during the Enlightenment was, whether it was Adam Smith, whether it was David Hume, whether it was Rousseau, we learnt that, and we kind of passionately embraced the notion that men and women are born equal. So they earn their desert and they earn their punishment. We started an effort and contribution. We don't value the effortless contribution, and we don't value useless effort. We value what we value and what we think is fair is actually efforts that grow the pie rather than redistribute it. And if I asked you, if I did a test, there's not time, most of you in this room would actually think that, notwithstanding his eccentricities, that Alan Sugar is more worth his millions than the Duke of Westminster. And so I end up with a definition of fairness that was first used by Karl Marx. From each according to his ability, to each according to his contribution. Not in the higher state of communism, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. In fact, in the Gotha program, Marx acknowledges that actually we'll only ever escape basic human motivations after decades and decades and decades of communism. And he's not absolutely clear that you'll ever actually get there. Because he knows, and he was right, in my view, that actually human beings are born with an inherent desire to link the discretionary effort to the contribution you get. So here's my definition of fairness. Due desert for discretionary effort. And I'm with the early Marx on this, and I'm with Mark Hauser on this, and I try to demonstrate that that's where we go. Now, I want to discuss luck, because you're thinking, or you should be thinking, if you haven't got bored or your mind's not wandering, we will get to Britain, we'll get to the financial crisis, and we'll get what to do about putting our society back together again in a little while. But I want to spend just another 2 or 3 minutes discussing fairness. Everyone's thinking, well, that's all very well, but I mean, if you're interested in sport, I mean, I may be interested in, why should Frank Lampard, I like playing football, why should Frank Lampard make 130,000 a week and not me? I mean, he's got talent, I haven't. I mean, is that fair? What about the concert pianist? What about David Held, endowed with all this intellectual faculties to be, the great professor and senator of the Institute of Global Governance? Is it fair that he should have that? What's he done?
An awful lot.
And that's the point. Frank Lampard he's the last man off the training bridge. The concert pianist has spent 10,000 hours refining her art. And actually, the point is, you are endowed with talents, all of you. And some of you have worked harder at working them up than others. And actually, inherently, you think it's fairer that those who've done that, despite the fact they might have, because they could have wasted their talents. And then you get to this point about, well, what about good and bad luck? And here I think about the National Health Service. See, I think that we know there's lots of luck about. I mean, here we are, there's 300 people here. I know that the statistics tell me that 7 or 8 of you will get pancreatic cancer. Can't tell you what it's going to be, but I know that in a population of 300 people, there'll be 7 or 8 who get it. And it's only fair that the 293 of us in this room that haven't got that gene, but don't know it, actually put a helping hand out to the 7 of you who've got it. The National Health Service is, before it's egalitarian, before it's collectivist, is we want to compensate you for your bad luck service. Equally, good luck. There's 300 people in this room. I don't know, but there'll be 10 or 12 of you, and maybe 15 if the statistics are right, who are likely to inherit quite a lot of money. There'll be some who are going to inherit 2, 3, 4, 5 million pounds in this room. I don't, and that's just the luck of the draw. The case for inheritance tax is that I'm going to share, and I think the rest of us should share in your good luck. Inheritance tax is not a death tax. Inheritance tax is a we share in your good luck tax. And the reason why the Tories could never, ever privatize the National Health Service was because it's ultimately about a service which actually insulates us from the lottery of bad luck over health. It's only fair to have such a service. I would bolt some egalitarianism onto it, and I will bolt some collectivism onto it. But the reason why it's such an unassailable institution in Britain is for that reason, in my view. And you end up with I think that the fairness is, I think, a big challenge, of course, to the right on both the National Health Service and inheritance tax. It's obvious that it's a challenge to the right, but it's also a challenge to the left, because as Harriet Harman has discovered and others, people aren't as bothered about inequality as the left think. And one of the reasons why they aren't as bothered about inequality as the left think is because they're with the early Marx. They think from each according to his ability to each according to his contribution. Have you in any way done something that either to get out of the situation that you're in, or have you done something that merits you having more than me? And actually people are quite tough on this. They do accept, actually, that Frank Lampard doesn't attain them to the extent to which he's worth that kind of amount of money. And they ask very, very hard questions of the single mother who's had children by 7 or 8 fathers. And actually, they wouldn't be human if they didn't. So you get into quite interesting territory here. And what I'm going to try and lay out is how I think that the kind of inability to kind of really confront this has actually led us to some, I think, big mistakes. And lastly, every single one of you in this room cares about the process. You care about the process. You believe that you you want to have a chance to speak at a trial. You will, it's extraordinary. If I try to buy your vote off you, if I say, I'm going to give you £1,000 and I'll buy your vote off you, you'd be amazed, actually, how few of you will sell. You want to participate. You want parliamentary processes, you want adjudication processes at work that give you dignity, that you can trust, offer you equal treatment. The famous book, Getting to Yes, is about trying to get into the head of your interlocutor and actually finding a way by which you can help him or her to get off their high horse and come and accommodate themselves to you. That process of getting to yes is actually a fairness process. And here's two more points, which are very difficult. Democracy is a fairness process, and so can a market be a fairness process. If a farmer takes her produce to market, if her potatoes are better grown than the person on the next stall, she will expect you to acknowledge that by paying marginally more. It's her due desert for her discretionary effort. And walk around any market stall or farmer's market and you'll see what I mean. What's wrong with markets is that they're so frequently rigged. And what's wrong with markets is that when you try to generalize the process to arrive at perfect outcomes, they can't and won't ever do it. But actually, and here's a fundamental problem about capitalist societies, is that if I want to the due desert for discretionary effort, the only place I've got to that I can deploy to value my discretionary effort is the market. But the market makes absolutely no distinction as to whether I've done it in a productive way or an unproductive way. And that I think creates kind of enormous tensions. And here we get to the heart of what I want to say this evening, is that I argue that the Enlightenment is a moment, a swing moment in Western history, when actually we started to create societies where it wasn't ascribed by the bishop or the monarch what you should think or what your rewards should be. For the thousands of years up until that moment, actually the profits of society went to those who were born to it or who had captured it or who held it by force. And what the Enlightenment opened up, highly imperfectly, was actually the opportunity for people to get due desert for their discretionary effort. The reason why the pace of technological innovation really accelerates after 1750 is not just because because the Enlightenment does two things. It opens up the prospect of daring to know and scientific knowledge, but it also opens the opportunity of entrepreneurs being able to deploy that in a way which drives economic growth. Welcome to the world of my second big statement of general purpose technologies. General purpose technologies like the internet or the aeroplane or the three-masted sailing ship or the railway are ones that, or the wheel, are ones that actually transform economies and societies. It was the domestication of plants and animals that actually first allowed civilization to get going in 9000 BC, a general purpose technology. The wheel follows. Then you have the Bronze and the Iron Ages. And the big point is that in the last 250 years, more general purpose technologies than in the previous 9,000 years put together. And what can explain that? And what explains that, I think, is this emergence of societies where people can challenge the incumbent. They can take a technology, take an idea, and in a freer society, really challenge the landowner, challenge the emperor, challenge the king, challenge the duke, and you start to get a process of capitalist entrepreneurship. There's not time. It's 7 o'clock already. If there was time, I would take you through why I think 15th century Spain and 17th century France got themselves into such trouble, because they were closed societies. in which basically the king held all the economic rent and did a bargain with his noblemen and froze the process of challenge, churn, running with ideas. France, a society of tax farmers, Spain, a class of ever growing noblemen, so that by the when Spain goes into decline, almost 10% of the population of Spain can claim noble lineage, holding on to some tiny piece of land and passing on it to their children without any tax. This is a closed society. The Enlightenment busts it open. And of course, the first Enlightenment society, partial Enlightenment society, is Britain. And it's Britain with its imperfect franchise, Britain with its checks and balance constitution, Britain with its independent central bank that can sell debt, Britain that is a more open society to the building actually of productive entrepreneurship, but very imperfect. It's not a very perfect democracy. And already by the second half of the 19th century, it's been overtaken by the Americans and the Germans, who are investing hugely in education and their society and busting trusts as they were in the United States. It's a potted history, but what I want to try and get over to you is that these societies weren't particularly fair, but they were less unfair than what had preceded them. And that's my contention to the challenge that you laid out at the beginning. And then you get to Britain in the post-war period. Britain, with its still with a constitution that in many respects is pre-democratic. Britain with operating its system of corporatism with its pre-democratic constitution, entrenching companies and entrenching unions, not being particularly open to new forces, new ideas, new businesses, new technologies, new processes. And it starts to freeze. And it creates the crisis of the 1970s. I spell this out in the state we're in. And actually then we get Thatcherism. And her solution is not actually to create a more open access society, not to embrace notions of fairness and due desert for discretionary effort, but actually to reinvent an imagined past of a kind of free market utopia. And that opens the door to another rising oligarchic elite, finance, who use this language of the free market and the language of fairness, as I described in the opening my opening remarks, to build this astonishing shadow banking system and the credit growth that grew from it and landing us in the mess we're in today. But the big point was that the inability to think straight, where was the challenge to Reaganism and Thatcherism? Where was the social democratic challenge to it, and where was the one nation challenge to it at that time? How easy was it for her to get rid of the Ted Heaths, the Jim Pryors, and that one nation tradition? Answer, because they didn't have it, they couldn't say to her the way to actually get a dynamic economy is to embrace fairness, to give due reward to entrepreneurs, to link desert to contribution, to construct your social insurance system on that, your tax system on that, to construct your political system on that. That will open stuff up, Margaret. No one said that. And the Social Democrats and the Labour Party found they couldn't say it either when they lost in 1992. For me, 1992 is the third most important date in the post-war period. 45, 79, and 92, when New Labour lost, or when old Labour lost and New Labour was born, because that finally extinguished, in my view, the social democratic tradition in Britain. And New Labour decided to become a simulacrum of the marketeers in the Conservative Party, only nicer. They would do timid triangulation. They would have the politics of assurance to business, and that would be the bargain that would allow them to get elected in 97. with the remnants of their commitment to John Smith as being the only thing that would be radical that we would recognise, or the Social Democrats in this room would recognise, and hence the minimum wage, and hence what constitutional reform we got. After that, there were some good things done, but they were all second order. The big bargain remained, staying with the Thatcherite settlement, a Thatcherite settlement that actually, to my mind, had answered the question that was posed in the 70s incorrectly. And the last decade, between 97 and 2007, I mean, it is an astonishing story of the way in which the political class and the official class simply allowed this amazing shadow banking system to happen. They were told it conformed to market principles. They were told it would be economically efficient. And of course, and above all, they were told that it was only fair that actually this class of financial oligarchs should get their due desert for their innovation and their discretionary effort. And they had no rhetoric to fight back. No rhetoric to fight back. And some of the things that went on in that period, the Financial Services Authority, which I regard as a statutory trade association to promote the city. When you look at the statutes of the Financial Services Authority and the Act that established it, I mean, it is not to do. The people who run it, are not permitted actually to do things that would be contrary to the city's competitiveness, not to obstruct new kind of innovations. So the whole shadow banking system, the world of hedge funds, private equity, investment banking, broker-dealers, over-the-counter trading, collateralized debt obligations, structured investment vehicles, tax havens, credit default swaps, running into trillions and trillions of dollars, so that with those phenomenal numbers I gave you at the beginning, kind of dwarfing our GDP by many times, and finally allowing us, the taxpayer, to pick up the bargain at the end. What a grotesque deal that was. It was an unfair bargain. But no one blew the whistle. No one said, look, you can't do this stuff because the consequences of it will be, aside from its economic inefficiency, that the consequences will be, if things go wrong, unbelievably unfair, because we hadn't got an agreement, in my view, about what fairness means. The left were too preoccupied by it being a sort of egalitarian principles, and the right were in a world in which you have the deserving poor and the undeserving poor, and the rich who plainly, because they're rich, deserving all they've got without applying the test of whether there was any discretionary effort, genuine innovation at the base of it. So here we are. In 2009, I mean, unbelievable. You've got a budget deficit of 175 billion pounds, which must be got down. But actually, if it's got down too quickly, could create monumental kind of unemployment. We have an economy where, if you look at the FTSE 100, look at our great companies that the young men and women from the LSE will try to join. It's banks, it's mining finance houses, it's retailers, it's a few drug companies, a few defense contractors. It doesn't speak of a balanced economy. It doesn't speak of great enterprises that have been built up by entrepreneurs who want to produce great things with great ideas or technologies. We don't do that in Britain. We have a society in which the polarization grows, every 5-10 years. Danny Dorling, a social geographer at University of Sheffield, did a report just 10 days ago, reporting on how, ward by ward, you look at Sheffield, the people who, the 10 million people, the bottom 10 million people in Britain who earn £15,000 a year or less, are more and more focused in particular wards in cities like Sheffield, and the middle class more and more focused in other wards. There's no kind of social mix is disappearing. The people under 15 grand live with each other. Many of them in social housing live on 2/3 of them, 3/4 of them, I think the figure is 73% from John Hills's report, live on benefit John Hill's report, who's here, of course, illustrated, is John in the audience? I mean, John's fantastic report he did for the CLG, which shows that, you know, of the 4 million people in social housing, less than a dozen could move from one city to another within social housing. Aha! And then you've got our politics, an over-strong executive, an over-strong prime minister, in my view, a democratic assembly that doesn't deliberate very much, a media that is, you know, out of control. The Press Complaints Commission will not actually say boo to the News International. The amazing, you know, I think it's astonishing that a national newspaper, I mean, I think national newspapers obviously have political affiliations, but to declare 9 months before an election that you want one party to win and campaign for it for 9 months, you know, is just, I think, is any sense of, you know, what is that the role of a free media in a free society? Where everything you read in that paper will be slanted one way for 9 months? I don't think so. And what about the international economy? I mean, Gordon Brown, to his credit, floated the notion of an international transactions tax to kind of try to bound the limit of a financial system which is many times larger than world GDP now, tripled in relation to world GDP in just 25 years, and can't triple again in size, because if it does, the chance of black swan events that will hit one of the mega banks that have networks throughout, who have tentacles throughout the network, the contagion of that will bring the whole house of cards down. And who has to pick up the bill? People in this room, and tens of millions like us. Something has to be done at an international level about finance, about climate change, Copenhagen. What is the fair bargain between the developed world and the less developed world? And these are the challenges, I think, that face our whoever is elected in 2010. I've got a lot to say about how you can do things in each of these headings. I mean, I'm whether you're left of centre or right of centre, I hope you admire a company like Rolls-Royce. I went round Rolls-Royce's plant and service facilities in Derby recently, and it's a great thing to see. It's a British company, and there's one room where you can see where they monitor in real time 3,500 Trent and RB211 engines in the air. So they're sitting there. There's a bank of monitors, and they can watch actually in real time and the performance of these engines as they fly. And if there's minute deviations, they can alert the airline to not just the fact that there's a slight deviation from performance, but actually what it might be and how long they've got before they have to ground the plane and do something about it. That's a British company. That's productive entrepreneurship. Britain has got one Rolls-Royce. It should have 50. And you have to ask the question: why don't we get more Rolls-Royces? Why have we said, well, the architecture in which such companies grow is a matter of indifference. Leave it to the market. Who's going to come forward like Rolls and Royce and grow a company like that? The average life expectancy of companies now, a third of them died in the 80s, 40% died in the 90s, half of them died within 3 years in the noughties. We have to populate our population of dying small firms with new firms. We have to have an architecture that actually scales them up. And you won't get people to come forward unless they think they can get scale, unless they're going to get backing, unless they can exploit their talents, if they don't get due desert for their discretionary effort. Otherwise, they'll all fuck off to the city. And we have to, as a national community, we have to start putting in place an innovation and investment framework. We have to also think very carefully about how we're going to reduce this deficit. I am absolutely, this notion that it is unfair to future generations that the national debt is going to rise to 85% of GDP in 2015, and that the fair thing to do is to bring the deficit down much faster than even the Labour government is planning, because we don't want to hand on to our grandchildren so much debt. Well, is that an appropriate response? Is that the fair response to the situation in which we find ourselves? After a crisis of this type, we know that with the private sector flat on its back, it can take not just 5 years, 10, 15 years before you get the private sector to get back on its feet. Richard Koo, a great economist at Nomura Research International, argues that, you could be a fiscal conservative and keep things tight in the long 30-year upturn which capitalist economies have. When they go into their long 20 or 30-year downturn, after an event like the credit crunch we've been through, the state is the spender and borrower of last resort. It's only fair that it discharges that obligation. Because there will be other cycles, we know, in the future. And I always say to people, and I've said it in this lecture room before, and I want to repeat it tonight, some of you will not have heard it. Between 93 and 2000, we turned things around by 10% of GDP. The roof didn't fall in on our heads. We raised taxation. We constrained the growth of public expenditure, and we got to the other side of a big crisis. We just got to do the same again, not do it in 7 years, in my view. Let's take 8 or 9. Let's not do it in 3 or 4 years. And by the way, when we get to the end of it, where will the national debt be? It'll be where it's been for lower than it was between 1750 and 1870. It was Macaulay who actually said that every decade from 1750 to 1870, Tories said, let's get the debt down. And actually, some people in the audience will not, of course, be so keen on English expansion as some of other. Let's be neutral about British expansion. But his point was that actually the British couldn't have kept a fleet on 5 oceans, couldn't have won the Napoleonic Wars, financed the Industrial Revolution without actually allowing the debt to GDP ratio to go to 300%. And I can tell you, speaking personally, I have no sense that my forebearers did me a bad deal. And then the national debt went down, and it went back up again to above 85% of GDP from 1914 to 1980, and now it's low again. And it's going to go back up to those levels. Look at the last 260 years, all but 60 of them, between 1750 and 2010, the national debt was higher than it will be in 2015. So I think that we have to think quite carefully about this. We also have to think about what's fair from the government's point of view. What's fair from the collectivity of British citizens? You pay tax, you spend on things like infrastructure, you spend on things like universities. I would argue that it's your due desert that you get tax yield for the discretionary effort you've made in giving taxes to the authorities. It's only fair to pay tax. Because if you want the things that come off tax, you've got to pay in to get it back. That's Lionel Hobhouse, 1911. And I like Hobhouse's views. I think that his big point about the march of science and technology, when he says, citing Isaac Newton, if I can see further than other men, it's because I stand on the shoulders of giants. Actually, all scientific advance is kind of incremental, depending on what others have done. We move, science moves through the collective investment, and scientific knowledge becomes something that is, owned by all of us, actually. And then the next generation of scientists and technologists play with that cumulative knowledge to add more to the stock. And Hobhouse said that there's not a scientist alive who doesn't owe his or her kind of light bulb moment to the efforts of others. And actually, 95% of the return should thus go to the state in the form of taxation. Not a thing that you hear much in 2009, but actually, if you look at, I always like to hear, Alicia Bell patented the telephone 3 hours before, Alicia Gray patented the telephone 3 hours before Alexander Bell in the 1870s. They both had the same stock of technology. You could build a telephone because the kit lay all around you. And one man got there a few hours before the other, and his lawyer said, don't worry about the patent, the telephone's not going to fly. But my point is that rather than think of entrepreneurs and scientists having light bulb moments that are independent of actually what has been collectively generated, we should think, I think, in different categories. And I think you start to, that reframes completely the way we think about public finances, in my view. Third challenge, fourth challenge, fifth challenge, it's 7:25. I'm not going to devote much more time to it. I want to take your questions, and I want you to tell me that I don't know what I'm talking about. But there's a whole story about how we rebalance our society. And again, I just don't think it's fair. I don't think it's any kid's due desert that actually, if they're born in some ward in Bognor or some ward in Sheffield, that has got kind of unique concentrations of social deprivation, that should be a kind of a lifelong sentence. I think in exactly the same way that you put your hands in your pocket for the handful of people in this room who have pancreatic cancer, so you've got to put your hands in your pocket to alleviate the condition of people who draw the bad luck lottery of being born in a place like that. The kids don't deserve it. And so I think there has to be mobilization, not actually I think New Labour's done a bit, but there's been no sense of mobilization to actually redress this disadvantage, nor actually to attack the way the professional middle classes can passport their way to actually privileged positions in our society. But, and here's a but, we wouldn't pull this off if you relieve people who are in these circumstances of any responsibility for why they're there. I mean, it's actually often they who actually are the fastest to blow the whistle on, the new arrival who hasn't earned their free prescription or hasn't earned, in their view, the flatter house in which they're living through behaving properly and well. And by the way, they're right. And so if you do this mobilization without inbuilt rules that respect those fundamental human predispositions, you get into trouble. You can't just do it as a simple collectivist egalitarian act. You've got to respect, if you like, the marks of the early Gotha program. Rebalancing our politics. I've said what I want to say there. I mean, what I do beware an incoming Conservative government dropping, in effect, a British version of the fairness doctrine for broadcasting. If we have a situation in which Sky News can behave like Fox News without any obligations for impartiality or balance, because allegedly the whole system provides that, we will invent for ourselves a public conversation very like that in the States. Rebalancing politics is not just a story of what we do with an MP's expenses and the balance between the centre and the locality. It's also a story about what we do, about the way we conduct a public conversation. And lastly, we've got to do something about the international. David runs, David's work here is, he is the, he is the leader in the UK, I think. His books on this are arguing for an intelligent, kind of cosmopolitan, kind of liberal, kind of international democracy, and are, I think, where I'm at too. And I guess what my point is, and there's only a few words left for me because I must stop talking, is that unless we can try to really refine these notions on fairness, I don't think we're going to get a climate deal. I think we're going to get a reshaped IMF and UN. And I think that we need to have when the less developed world says to the developed world, well, actually, it's your due desert that actually you pay a lot more than us for putting the climate right, because actually almost all the carbon in the atmosphere is what you did. Actually, A, they're human to say it, and B, they're right. And we have to recognize that and have a discourse which recognizes it. But simultaneously, we can say that a deal, does require kind of obligations on them too, going as we progress. And around that kind of framework, I think you could get some progress, if not at Copenhagen, afterwards. So here we are, a kind of a monumental moment, really, in all our lives. Unemployment for 19 to 18 to 24-year-olds, 950,000, the highest in Europe. Cameron's figures were right on that. A long, slow recovery, an economy which is out of balance, and we cannot go back to business as usual. And I think that for me, it's as I've been reiterating throughout, I hope like a golden thread, this kind of, I think one can kind of build a consensus of the majority around a shared conception of fairness. We need a left, and in a way, I think that when left of centre politicians talk about their commitment to equality, they don't do it with, they don't do it very much, and when they do it, and they try to do it with passion, that audiences really don't hear them. And I think that what we want from left of centre politicians is a passion about Enlightenment values, and at the core of the Enlightenment, the sense that you challenge incumbent power, you dare to know, and you look for fair process and fair outcomes. In a way, the left of centre, I think, kind of is the trustee of that tradition, and it's abrogated its responsibility for too long. And as we're likely to elect a Conservative government in 2010, we need it very, very badly to recognise that that old discourse of smashing the state, and liberating the market, and doing it all through charity is really only part of the story. There's a challenge, I think, to both left and right in these ideas, and there's not much time to get it right. Thank you very much.
Well, we have plenty of time, well, some time for questions. Thank you, Will, for your very wide-ranging talk, starting with philosophical reflections on fairness and ending with a program for contemporary British politics. I think it would be fair to say that questions could be put to each element of this program. I'm going to take questions in clusters of 5 to get them on the ground, and if we could get you, Will, fairly, not to be too long in your response to each and every one of these questions, then we can get a second and third round as well. So we've got roaming mics. Please, can your questions be short and tight so there's plenty of time for the gentleman at the back. I'm coming up, just a second.
Thank you very much. Rebalancing, I think, is the crucial word. 2 brief points. I was surprised that you said the private sector recover in 5 to 10 years. Isn't the fact that we saw our manufacturing industry absolutely decimated in the 80s by Thatcherite economic policies? And I say that as a former One Nation Tory MP, where unemployment in 2 of my towns went up, I say possessively, but I was trying to help them. 2 of my towns went up to over 30% within 3 years, and it's never recovered because our economy's been totally out of balance, probably long before then, but it became markedly so then. And second, very brief point, what are you going to do? How can we tackle the grotesque distortion in pay in this country? And it really is grotesque. It's not just the bankers. It's footballers versus nurses. It's local council chief executives earning 3 times as much as the Prime Minister. When are we going to get the values of this country right? We've got to get it right. And it's time that, how are we going to do it?
Lady at the top. Yes.
How do you define contribution?
How do you define contribution? Good question. Yes, the guy at the back with his arm up.
So I have 2 questions. The first one is, I don't know if you've read it, but John Romer's 1998 book, Equality of Opportunity. I'm not sure how your proposal about fairness differs from his. And if you have read it, how would you say it has? Or it does, sorry. And the second one is, if we know that markets are problematic, how do we determine value? So we know they're corrupt, we know that they're undergirded by something going wrong. How do we determine value, and how do we decide how we reward CEOs? Related to the first question, I suppose.
Yeah.
Pretty tough.
Keep
I'm
going.
going to go lie down, actually.
What's the best way of eliminating rent-seeking from finance?
Okay. And one more down here. Anybody down here? Yes, guy at the front. Sorry, come back to you.
When you look at existing institutions, national and international, how far do you see them as being fit for purpose in supporting fairness?
That's 5, isn't it, Will?
That is 5 really big questions.
Yes, we're going to come back to the audience, and you can start next time. Let me just throw in one other thought whilst you're there, because I'll keep it very brief. I mean, I found it may be because you didn't spend enough time on fairness. I have to say I found your explication of this, or at least the grounds for your explication of choosing fairness as the leading normative principle, as it were, very hard to follow. I mean, you say that we are all born with an intuitive ability to hold people account for their intentions, but we're born with an ability for all sorts of things, egotism, selfishness, so on. You just have to spend time with children or watch your playground to see the multiplicity of intuitive talents children have. So you could make an argument from any one of these intuitive capacities to a variety of sorts of principle. So saying that we are born with some intuitive ability doesn't really swing the argument, it seems to me, necessarily in your direction. I often think, Lord of the Flies is an underestimation of the problem of raising children, even though I'm a social democrat. I mean, the amount of times you spend having to say no, constrain, this, rule, that, shows in some senses the mighty complexity of human impulses and so on. And since you just picked this out as the core of your argument, one needs to know the grounds. And that brings us to the key principle of fairness itself. At every point, of course, the problem is due desert for discretionary evidence. What is a contribution? How do you assess it? What is desert? And how do you measure it? What is discretionary? And that is where the political argument is. Because there is not, from first principles, a common agreement about these things. And that is why you need perhaps less argue from core grounds of principles of justice or fairness, and maybe you have to argue from principles of democracy, deliberation, and accountability, a different way of getting at similar conclusions. Stop. Sorry, I didn't adhere to my own rules of being very brief.
Well,
Start at the top.
Start at the top.
And be brief.
And be brief. Well, there's, I've been wrestling with this for 6, 7, 8 months, and actually arguably longer, because I began reading for this long before that. So, and I fully acknowledge that it's work in progress to a degree, but let me go one by one. I mean, your passionate thing about pay. I think that what took place in the last 30 years is this amazing shadow banking system, the amazing returns that were made in it. There's a whole story about why it was that actually the people in it were allowed to make the money that they made, and I mean dynastic fortunes were made, and that had a ratchet effect. First of all, on the CEOs in America and then in Britain, so that CEO pay went up from kind of 30 to 1 to over 100 to 1 in Britain, and it's closer to 500 to 1 in the States. And then that had a ratchet effect, I think, on public service, actually. So, you see Mark Thompson and the BBC getting big money, following in the train of all of this, and finally, the people who run local authorities. Are, and the people who run our great companies 3 times as effective as they were 30 years ago? Is their discretionary efforts so much more valuable that they're worth all the extra dessert? Plainly not. And the way you get at this, it seems to me, is that I think we have to. I mean, I think it's now kind of a deep cultural thing. I mean, when you try to take the money off these people, Warren Buffett tried to take money off people in Solomons in the 1990s. He said the whole reward system is crazy, and half the Solomons walked, and he had to disinvest from the investment bank and retire her. He couldn't come up with a way of remunerating people in a way that they would stay in the investment bank. We have to scale the size back of this sector. That's the insufficient condition for doing something. We have to scale it back, and we have to make it as profitable. It has to have much more capital at its core. We have to break up the scale of it so that the individual actors in it are much smaller. We have to have much less leverage in it. We have to remove the implicit taxpayer guarantee. And I think we have to set upper limits to what bonuses are. So and then the word is that Harriet Harman is considering beginning a high pay commission, and I think that is an extremely good idea in this sense. And I think that the question the high pay commission should be asking is, and it comes to your point actually, David, is not we're going to ban you from say having pay of X, but what we are going to ask is actually what are the circumstances? How have you rigged the market to be able to afford to pay yourself that much when it's so out of line with everyone else? And then there should be automatic referrals by the High Pay Commission to the Competition Commission, who should do, as of right, or mandated to do, a really tough competition inquiry. Now, the next thing is that what do you do about manufacturing? My point about the 50 Rolls Royces. Look at Derby, which has got Bombardier, Toyota, and Rolls Royce. It's a city which is actually got relatively good social behaviours. You don't get that much violence, street crime, all the rest of it in Derby. You do in Stoke, which doesn't have any of those. So how do you bring those big companies to Stoke? Well, the first thing you have to do is to stop them from collapsing in places like Derby, where they are. And I tried to say what I thought about our institutional architecture, which doesn't support that. Look, the trouble is that to do this quickly, I'm not going to do it justice. But suffice to say, I have a suite of things to do. Come and see me afterwards, or buy the book, and it'll be fine. So I contribute. How do I assess contribution? And that was both from David and a questioner. Well, I think that, and you're right to say, David, that it is that there's no agreement on it. But one of my criticisms about Michael Sandel, and actually by inference you, is to imagine that just by having effective deliberation that will come to an answer. It seems to me that if you deliberate without at least some kind of anchor values, your chances of coming to an answer which has legitimacy is going to be quite small. And that's why I've been so keen actually to home in on fairness and the cluster of values around it, because I think that there are some anchor values around which one could get some adherence. I think that I think the answer actually to how you get, and people aren't going to like this very much, but I think it is the only answer one can come up with in a capitalist society. It is a genuinely highly competitive market, which actually allows a firm or an individual to assess whether their discretionary effort, how it's rewarded. And when you see excessive reward, you always see bent markets. You see bent markets in the Premiership. You see bent markets in banking. You see bent markets in the way remuneration committees fix CEO salaries. And what you have to do is you have to open it completely up. And that, for me, is a kind of a democratic story. There's no other way to do it. I think on this Roma question, yes, there are strong echoes of that thinking with mine. And that all I would say is that that was written before the financial crisis and before we've gone through what we've gone through. And I think the urgency of the questions that were posed there is now more, and there's more people prepared to kind of buy the propositions, and it's worthwhile rolling them out again, in my view. What to do about rent-seeking finance? I think that we must, one way or another, we have got to break banks up. We've got to have the Americans bust Standard Oil in 1911. There has to be a trust-busting moment across the European Union and the United States of these enormous banks. And we can allow them to be universal banks, but smaller, or we can break them up in this Glass-Steagall, the commercial banking and the kind of casino banking is separated. There's a variety of ways that you can do it, but it must be done. I think that there's, and then I think that we have to the idea, and I do find the idea that the banking sector got to 5 times GDP in 2007 with deposit insurance at the time was just £2,000. And the banks were resisting that there should be more deposit insurance. Just so you have a benchmark in your mind, banking as a share of GDP was 50% in the 19th century, right up until 1950. That was where it was. It was so it's one of the most amazing phenomena that we've ever witnessed, I think. It's right up there. There's a whole agenda for how you do it. Are institutions international institutions fit for purpose in terms of fairness?
No, and move on.
No, and move on. Although there's something in the Constitution which you can latch onto, but the answer is no. And I think I tried to answer your question as best I could.
Listen, we've got a little bit more time. Where's the roaming mic at the top? Yeah, give it to the guy at the front. We'll try and take a few more questions as quickly as we can.
I think you partly answered this question, but is one of the reasons that we don't have more Rolls Royces or Bombardiers or why SMEs fail, part of the reason behind that is that Tesco and Starbucks, they hold so high barriers to market entry. Time was, if you wanted to serve coffee or sell groceries, you would get a loan from a credit union, have your own business, get just dessert for your discretionary effort. And the only game in town is Tesco now. If we lower barriers to market entry, is that fairer?
I think so. Yeah.
Mine's probably a slightly different take on that question, but it's actually more of a comment where I disagree with your views. You refer to scientific and manufacturing as the solution forward, and that's the things that you place value. They're those types of innovations. However, you seem not to value financial innovation, and in fact, I believe your comments were that some of those products were so sophisticated and so complex. However, yet that is also a form of innovation and given competitive advantage of resources moving away. I'd sort of like to understand why your views are placed in that direction.
Thank you. Lady, yes. Lady, hand up. Yeah.
I'd like to go back on this due dessert business. The banks are far above the mind-blowing efforts of certainly people like me, but I'd like to go down to the more ordinary people. I want to know how we can get more logic and more fairness in the pay and salaries of people further down. Why is the bus driver, thank God we've got bus drivers, paid more than graduate teachers? And why are nurses paid so little? There's a whole lot of imbalance. And just to add to due dessert, why are women paid so much less than men? In the city, thank you very much. In the city, they are paid 50% of the males doing exactly the same job.
Hello. I'm old enough to actually have raised money from the old 3i group And one of the things which just seems to me is that that type of financing for manufacturing industry and things like that just doesn't really exist anymore. So shouldn't there be a requirement when everything is being sorted out that actually the banks are made to recapitalize 3i in the way that it was established in the 40s by, you know, making them put in £500 million each or whatever, and then giving that organisation that very specific requirement to drive industrial development and all the smaller companies that 3i was actually sorted out to help support.
Yeah. Yeah. Guy at the end. Yeah.
Earlier on in your talk, you mentioned about our system, the basic parliamentary system we got, and the fact that it's got quite a few. I don't think you used the word feudal, but it's got still got some sort of feudal hangovers in the House of Lords and all the rest of it. When the scandal of the MPs' expenses first broke, in that furore and the anger that immediately followed that, there was a lot in the media about, oh, we're going to, come the next election or before the next election, we're going to reform the system, we'll have proportional representation, we'll have the recall of MPs, we'll have a democratically elected House of Lords, we'll do this, that and the other. And that chat went on for about a fortnight. And now the dust has settled, it's all completely vanished. It's as if it's, back to situation normal, and the chance of any real political reform seems to have vanished. Got anything to say about that?
Okay, Will, just to come back to my question for a second.
Which is an important question.
It's about the standing of the argument. It's not about so much your conclusions, but it's about the standing of the argument as a philosophical argument. You say effective deliberation. You want to anchor the argument in some durable values, some sustainable values which shape and constrain politics. Then the question is to you, where do you get these values from? Because all parts of the political spectrum want to anchor politics in certain kinds of values. What will trump your conception of fairness, or the principle of fairness, in relation to contending principles and contending values, is how you provide a rationale and a foundation for those arguments that, anchor them in something that is very firm. And that's when I thought your opening point on this intuitive ability and so on is actually not a very strong argument. So I would really love you in your concluding remarks to come back to help persuade us as to why it is a strong argument and why you think it trumps other intuitive abilities, let's say, to be egotistical, selfish, nasty, horrible, which we all have, unfortunately, in quite considerable abundance. Now, you've got 5 minutes to wrap up, so maybe you could come to that at the end.
Well, there's a point made about Tesco, and this is a. It should be clear by now that my agenda is a charter against economic rent and against monopoly, and really understanding how dynamically bad it is. It's not just bad because it entrenches power and wealth at a moment in time. It actually freezes the whole dynamic process. So you answered your question, and I agree with you. Then there was a point about 3Is, I think, and I, just to say this, these figures I think are astonishing. British banks have lent 1.8 trillion pounds. They spent trillions of other dollars and euros to other people, but they've lent 1.8 trillion pounds. The British, 1.2 trillion is lent to your mortgage. 350 billion is lent on commercial property. There's about 200 billion on consumer credit. There's another kind of 100 billion on working capital, and there's virtually nothing to support investment and innovation. I mean, that is the numbers. There is no way that you can put that right without constructing, I don't think, A, breaking up the banks, B, we need them to have different business models, and C, we need to build some public private banks and some public banks and some initiatives like what the old 3Is used to do that actually, fills the gap. Otherwise, we're never going to have 50 Rolls Royces. I mean, that's just I've thought that for 40 years, and I think it even more strongly now. And one of the things that I find so upsets me, actually, I get physically sick about it, is that this opportunity presented itself over the last 18 months to do something, and it wasn't taken. And it's one of the great missed moments. I mean, there was one great missed moment in the 1945-51 government when we didn't abolish private schools. And people like me will be sitting in this lecture hall in the next 30, 40, 50 years saying there was one missed moment when Alistair Darling and Gordon Brown did not reform the banking system in 2007, 2010. It was a moment and didn't do it. In fact, the most amazing thing of all is that I think it's the most amazing thing of all. Was that actually in the spring summer of 2008. Alistair sat down with a chap called Vin Bischoff, who has become the chair of Lloyd's, and started an inquiry into how you promote the city's international competitiveness. It then had the bailout of the banks. It reported in May of this year, the Bischoff report, and it said essentially that whatever the response the government made to the crisis, it should actually be, to promote the city's international competitiveness, which is of overriding importance to the country, that any increase in regulation should be kept to a minimum, and there should be no increase in taxation, otherwise it will all go elsewhere. And that was co-chaired by the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And and sitting on that committee were almost solidly bankers with a banking and financial background. I mean, in the Macmillan report in the early 1930s, and the Wilson investigation, which weren't particularly successful in bringing about change, at least there was a cross-section of the business community, the academic community, and even trade unions represented, not on the Bischoff report. So I feel very, very strongly about that. Am I against what do I think about financial innovation? I do think that some of the financial innovation, I mean, there's not time, but I do think conceptions like value at risk, the collateralized debt obligation that housed other collateralized debt obligations, a CDO squared, and then a treble CDO. These are innovations where there's 1.6 billion pages of documentation around some of these structured investment vehicles, unreadable by anyone. And I think that there was a fiction that actually one could manage risk, because black swan events fell in a Gaussian distribution, bell curve distributions, inside a long tail, and actually that was never the way that actually bad events or what we know are likely events, but you can't predict when they're going to happen, but they're going to happen. The mathematics that was associated with it, I think, was profoundly faulty, and no story of what happened in the last 15 years is possible without actually getting into the false mathematics that sat behind the innovation. And the innovation was driven by a desire to grow balance sheets very, very fast, because it would endow people with very, very big remuneration. And laws were bent. I mean, the way that Hank Paulson campaigned to get, or not so much about Hank Paulson, but Sandy Weil campaigned to get rid of Glass-Steagall, so travellers could be reversed into Citigroup. I mean, I find the whole thing an amazing, amazing story. I mean, it makes I Claudius, or so I could rank things that have happened in our in history seem tame, really. Does that mean that every financial innovation is a bad thing? No. Do I think that wealth generation is only about technologies and science? I do, actually. But that's not to say that I think that innovation is that the humanities, the social sciences, the acts of creativity in the culture and creative industries are not, essential kind of components of the process. Because if you don't have culture demand, you don't have any supply. There's an interaction between these things, and any monocausal explanation of anything goes wrong. On political reform has gone quiet. You're right, political reform has gone quiet. By the way, MPs themselves feel it very acutely. And I was in the, they think that a third, maybe more, of the current House of Commons won't be back, actually, in 2010. And MPs themselves, I mean, their morale is rock bottom. They feel themselves to be despised. They think that as, democratic representatives, that better is owed to them, but recognise that this particular House of Commons can never earn it, and the sooner the curtain goes down on it, the better. But you're right. A good story on political reform has not been made. I mean, again, there was talk about, whether it's proportional representation, whether it's more power to cities and city regions. I mean, wherever you want to talk, the process is not good, and we need more bottom-up pressure. I think more bottom-up pressure, because for my money, the kind of what I call an open access society is in part about using political institutions and democracy to kind of open up kind of entrenched economic power and the economic rent that goes with it. You don't have that. If that process is imperfect or screwed up, you're not at first base, and it's never been very good in Britain. And lastly, David's challenge. I mean, there's contestation over what fair means. I mean, I ran across, off the record, unattributably, and there was Channel House rules. Michael Howard once told me that he wished he'd fought the 2005 election on a fairness ticket. He thinks the Tories should have made fairness their ticket, and that ideas like earned citizenship and tough love were only fair. And Hollow was, well, that's what he said. But it's wait. Well, I know, but I mean, let me just. I mean, if you're on the liberal left, and I am, I can't. In the same way that you can't say that you can't say that you have that only my tradition has a monopoly of this value. You can't say that, I don't think. But you can, any more than you can say, I don't think. Otherwise, you get yourself in a terrible, terrible place. But what you can say, it seems to me, and this is why I've kind of broken my head in trying to come up with the best I can do, and it may not be good enough, in actually trying to adumbrate what the principles are of fairness, so that the traditions they'll fight over it and they'll lay claim to it, but in the act of arguing about it, if there's some shared idea of what the bloody thing means, you have a likelihood that the electorate at large can vote one way or the other. If you don't make the attempts, and maybe my attempt has not convinced you, David, but there's enough kind of stuff coming up from the audience which suggests that the lady who suggests why bus drivers paid more than graduate teachers, and your point about the way women are paid, I mean, that's a fairness question. And I think if you...
Of course it's a fairness question.
But if you say... Well, I've only had an hour.
No, he can't. He can't do that, because fairness requires that staff at the LSE go home. They go home at 8 o'clock. We respect their rules, and so it remains for me on that note to say that thank you all very much for coming. Obviously, discussion could go on. Thank you.